Hello again, it's Richard Cassette here, SAGE Program Coordinator for Bedford Road. In a previous video, I outlined our SAGE Learner profile to create an introduction to what how we define and identify giftedness in our school division. And in this video, I'm going to follow that up by looking at how we design our classroom, our learning spaces, and our curriculum to best address the needs of those gifted learners in a congregated setting. So here we go. First of all, we try to create a space that best addresses the unique abilities, so the skills, the dispositions, and the needs of our gifted population. And we do this by keeping in mind that SAGE learners, and we know this from research, SAGE learners strive in discursive learning spaces with like-minded peers. What we mean by that is that a SAGE learning space tends to be a very active, very noisy, and very discussion-based space in which students are conferring and bouncing ideas both off of each other as well as off the teacher. So it tends to be a space where you would walk in and you would see people in discussion on a regular basis, rather than it being a space where people are quietly working on their work alone. It might even seem like a mess at times, but it's a mess with a lot of learning. Number two, we rely a lot on the co-construction of norms and processes and expectations. We do this because, as I iterated in the last video, our SAGE students tend to be very ethically oriented, very driven by deep underlying foundational ideals that they firmly believe ought to be given a space in their learning. So something that we might do, say, very early on in the beginning of grade 9, within the first week, is to actually spend a few hours co-constructing what our classroom norms will be, and then creating a way to visually represent these for everyone in the class, giving as much ownership as possible as we can to the entire group, with the understanding that we would hold each other accountable for maintaining and living up to those norms moving forward. Third, in terms of evaluation and feedback, we use what's called an interactive feedback loop, meaning that students prepare their responses to the learning, and then we, as much as possible, share those between peers and teachers so that students can receive feedback from both their peers and from their teacher, all in the aims of gradually improving their ability to take that feedback and look at the rubric or the shared criteria for learning, and then develop self-evaluations. So for example, by the end of a first semester in grade 9, one of our final tasks or tests would be to look at the extent to which a student could individually, accurately, and insightfully assess a major assignment that they've completed, thinking about feedback from others, looking at the criteria, looking at the content, and then ultimately setting goals for themselves and developing that cognitive self-awareness that helps them grow as learners over time. We find that that skill is an essential skill for all learners, and SAGE students happen to have the metacognitive predispositions to allow them to do that, and to do that earlier than some of their peers. Number 4, we work on convergent skills and content. So meaning we'll be looking at the same curricular content, right? The same questions, the same stuff. But when it comes to responding, we do not use convergent tasks. So we're not all writing the same test, or we're not all writing the same essay, or we're not all producing the same project. Rather, students are invited to come up with their own, or to choose from a list, come up with their own mode of expression that allows them to combine their personal angle on the content, as well as their interests and skills and passions, to create unique and interesting ways of expressing their learning. Number 5, there's a focus on higher order thinking skills and deep inquiry throughout. In a regular classroom, we may spend more of our time on lower level thinking tasks, such as coming to remember and coming to understand the outcomes. Whereas in a SAGE course, because we're processing perhaps at a more rapid pace and with a little deeper desire, we go to those higher levels of thinking, and we're able to spend more time on stuff like analysis, evaluation, and ultimately those creations of unique modes of expressing our learning. And number 6, we tend to use play. I mentioned this in the previous video, so that you would see, especially in a SAGE Humanities course, you would see a lot of interactive simulations that have students adopting roles from real world situations that allow them to both grapple with the content, engage with the critical guiding questions, while also testing their skills and their understandings in ways that allow them to really get an experiential approach of the learning. And we do this all under the guise of trying to make these things as real world as we can, right? To keep them applicable to the present moment and to what precedes the present moment, looking to create a habit in our students that their learning in school should be geared towards real world current problems. From our SAGE curricula, I think you can see a mirroring here of some of the things that I spoke about. So a suitable program like ours that congregates academically talented students should address gifted learners by doing the following: broadening abilities or skills beyond what is possible in a regular classroom setting, because we're able to create an entire space accommodated for those gifted learners. B, allowing for a variety of ways in which students may demonstrate their learning. We spoke to that. C, we're able to alter the pace, the resources, and the experience so that as much as possible, we can nurture each individual student's sense of curiosity. D, we're able to provide extension and in-depth analysis so that we can stretch those critical and analytic thinking skills. And as I mentioned previously, we do that by tending to spend more of our time working on higher order thinking skills rather than remembering, memorizing, and being able to repeat those answers back. E, there's a focus on instruction in a primarily indirect and or interactive manner. And that goes back to that discursive teaching that I mentioned previously. F, focusing on higher level thinking skills and interdisciplinary content. I haven't mentioned that yet. There's a lot of stress in our program, and I'll get to that in a subsequent video where we look at the programming options available. But there's always in SAGE grades 9 through 12, a stress on interdisciplinary work. So we have the math and the science that are supposed to interact, and then the English and the social studies, or the English and the history, that are meant to be treated in collaboration so that we're building those interdisciplinary understandings. And G, we allow for students to modify and adapt their own programs or their own work in the classrooms to ensure growth in areas that need improvement. And there comes that both group collaboration, right, along with the sharing and the co-constructing of norms and processes and standards, as well as the stress on each student being able to develop a deep self-awareness of their talents, their needs, and their areas to grow so that they can then plan accordingly and be mindful of that at every step of the learning process. So we also have some broad aims, and this is what I'd like to end with. This is also out of our curriculum. So this is common to all curricula, but it certainly takes on its own unique forms in the SAGE program. So our broad areas of learning, we aim for our SAGE students to be lifelong engaged learners, as well as engaged citizens. And we do this through those simulations and those real world applications. And we also look for our students to develop a sense of self, community, and place. And that second item is very important for the SAGE classroom. Because as I mentioned in our previous video, our SAGE students are outliers in a number of ways, right? They're different from their age-alike peer group. And so because of that, sometimes our SAGE learners struggle to belong or to have that sense of community and place amongst their peers in a regular classroom. And that's probably one of the greatest, if not the greatest, benefits to the SAGE program, is that our gifted learners, for the first time maybe, might find themselves in a room of other age-alike peers who share their unique dispositions, their unique abilities, and can really start to affirm for the first time some of those things that would have previously seemed unusual and out of place. The other thing that we work on in all of our curricula are cross-curricular competencies, and this is an especially important part of our SAGE program for the reason outlined in the previous slide regarding the emphasis on interdisciplinary work. So we work on developing thinking habits that stretch across curriculum and that help us understand that each subject area has its own methodology, its own analytic approach. We work on developing identity and interdependence. We work on developing literacies across curriculum, so being able to express ourselves and take in messages across different curricula, understanding the different languages, the different signs and symbols and communication tools that go into each subject area. And we hope and we look for our SAGE students to become, to develop a facility with that ability so that they can operate in multiple curricula at the same time. And last one, we encourage all of our SAGE students to develop social responsibility, and that is why the simulations and the real world applications are so important to what we do in our SAGE program. So there you have it. That's an overview of how we design our courses and all the different things that we have in mind when we're working with our gifted students. That's the end of this video. Thank you.